Greetings and welcome on behalf of Lumen Christi Institute and the Catholic Lawyers Guild of Chicago. My name is Tom Donnelly. I serve as a state trial judge here in Chicago, a board member of the Catholic Lawyers Guild of Chicago, and I am a longtime friend of Lumen Christi. You can learn more about Lumen Christi, including upcoming events this week on architecture in the Renaissance and evolution and the human person by visiting www.lumenchristi.org. The events in this past month with the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others serve as a reminder that we must work to hold difficult conversations about the ongoing legacy of racism in our communities, our legal institutions, our churches, and ourselves. For many of us, that conversation begins by listening more attentively. I want to thank our co-sponsors, America Media, the Catholic Lawyers Guild of Chicago, the Hanks Center at Loyola University Chicago, and Boston College for helping make tonight's event a success. It is fitting, especially on this, the feast of St. Thomas More, patron saint of lawyers, that we address the question of race, justice, and Catholicism by inviting renowned legal scholars to help us look at our church, our community, and our country. Our conversation tonight features Dean Vincent Rougeau and Professor Herschella Conyers, and will be moderated by Dean Eduardo Peñalver. For the sake of time, I will only briefly introduce them, but you can find their full bios on the event page online. Herschella G. Conyers is a clinical professor of law and the director of the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Clinic at the University of Chicago Law School. Professor Conyers co-teaches the intensive trial practice workshop and a seminar called Life and Death in the Law. Before joining the law school faculty, Professor Conyers served as an assistant public defender in the Cook County Public Defender's Office, where I met her in the hallways of 13th and Michigan in 1988 as another assistant public defender. She mostly, however, handled capital cases. Professor Conyers is a graduate of both the University of Chicago's College and Law School. Vincent Rougeau became Dean of Boston College Law School in July of 2011. He previously served as a professor of law and associate dean for academic affairs at Notre Dame Law School. Dean Rougeau is president-elect of the Association of American Law Schools and serves as a member of its executive committee. An expert in Catholic social thought, Dean Rougeau's current scholarly work considers the relationships among religious identity, citizenship, and membership in highly mobile and increasingly multicultural democratic societies. In June 2020, Dean Rougeau was named the inaugural director of Boston College Forum on Racial Justice in America by University President William Leahy, S.J. It is a pleasure to welcome back to Lumen Christi our moderator tonight. Eduardo M. Peñalver is the Alan R. Tesler Dean and Professor of Law at Cornell Law School. He previously served as the John P. Wilson Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School. He holds a BA from Cornell University and a JD from Yale Law School. Between college and law school, he studied philosophy and theology as a Rhodes Scholar at Oriel College, Oxford. Dean Peñalver clerked for Judge Guido Calabresi on the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and for Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens. Peñalver's books include Property Outlaws and An Introduction to Property Theory. After our moderated conversation, there will be time for Q&A from the audience. You can ask your questions at any time by using the Q&A feature in Zoom. If you are joining us by YouTube, you can email the Lumen Christi address listed in the description of the live stream. Eduardo, I'll now hand it over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. It's wonderful to be back here virtually, I guess, in Chicago and with Lumen Christi, and a real privilege to moderate this panel between our distinguished discussants. What I'd like to do, I thought a good place for us to start would be to just give each of you an opportunity to talk about your experiences with race and racism as African Americans within the American Catholic Church. Herschella, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you. And I am telling this small vignette because I told it to Tom years ago and he remembered it. And this is the one he asked me to tell. So as a young child, I attended Catholic school in a predominantly Black neighborhood. My family moved to Chatham, which was a neighborhood that had experienced white flight. And so there were homes and lawns and gardens. And the Catholic high school was like 4 blocks from my house. But in those days, you had to get permission from your parish pastor to go to a different Catholic school. My mother wanted us to stay at the school we had been attending because we had been there. Long story short, the pastor of the new parish that we were in sent a letter. My mother asked for permission, and he gave my mother a sealed envelope. My mother said to me, never take a sealed envelope from one white person to another white person. And she opened it. And when she opened it, the pastor had given her permission for us to remain in our schools because he said, no matter where you go, Black kids are uneducable. So that was the crux of that. We can talk later.
Vincent, why don't you talk about your experiences?
Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you. I guess I'll tell my experiences in a broader way. My family is from Louisiana originally. Both my parents were born and raised there, and both of them trace their families back. My father probably to the original European settlement by the French in Louisiana in the 18th century. My mother to the 19th century, but she also can trace her family back to the original colonial settlement of Maryland and North Carolina. So our roots are, deeply Catholic in North America. So we've sort of experienced American Catholicism in a way that isn't always typical in the minds of a lot of American Catholics. It was not the Catholicism of the big cities of the Northeast or Midwest. It was almost more indigenous in a way, Catholicism that came with the French and the Spanish. And so, my parents left Louisiana after college, and we were raised primarily in Washington, D.C., in the metropolitan area of Washington, D.C. and Maryland. But interestingly, just to connect with Hershella's story, my father did his undergraduate work slightly later than normal at Loyola University of Chicago, and my first job was there, so I want to shout out to Loyola, one of our co-sponsors. But in the 60s, my parents moved to the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago, where my sister, I was a couple years old, my sister was born in Chicago. We lived in St. Philip Neri Parish, just a couple blocks away, but when my mother took my sister to be baptized, or arranged for my sister to be baptized, she was refused by the parish priest. He told her that there was no possible way that she could have her child baptized in that parish. And she said, well, I live in this parish. He said, you may live in this parish, but I will not perform the sacraments on your child in this parish, because it was a white parish. And so my mother went to the cardinal and got the edict of the priest reversed. But I do think that was a very difficult experience for them. They had never actually experienced that kind of racism in Catholic churches in Louisiana. The church was open to all, and the idea that a parish had sort of a racial stricture to that in terms of the sacraments was pretty shocking. So for a long time after that, we didn't go to mass, and resumed our attendance in the, when we moved to the DC area, which also was not a place where the church was so ethnically identified in a much more diverse way. The Catholic Church thrived there. So anyway, I don't want to get too far into the details, but just to connect the stories and give you a little bit of my background. That's where we began.
Thanks for sharing those experiences. Maybe if we could step back a little bit and kind of build on that by bringing in provocative statement by Fordham's Brian Massingale in his book Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, and it kind of connects, I think, to your experiences in interesting ways, but you might also kind of contrast your differing experiences of the church with what he says. He says, he describes the American Catholic Church as a white racist institution. And he says, what makes it white and racist is not the fact that the majority of its members are of European descent, nor the fact that many of its members engage in acts of malice or bigotry. What makes it white and racist is the pervasive belief that European aesthetics, music, theology, and persons, and only these, are standard, normative, universal, and truly Catholic. And I just wanted to pose that statement and ask whether you agree with his assessment, whether that's consistent with your experience of the church in the various places you've lived, or to what extent you disagree with it. Vincent, why don't you start with this one?
Okay. Yeah, building off what I had said before, I mean, I think the church in the United States, the Catholic experience in the United States is very diverse. And, as I was beginning to say, there's an immigrant experience of Catholicism that's closely tied to the waves of immigration that occurred, particularly in the 19th and early 20th century. And that is highly identified with the big cities in the Northeast and Midwest. And I guess in a way, the church in this country was very successful in assimilating European immigrants into the American mainstream. And in a sense, maybe they were too successful, because in a sense, what I think that did was it created this culture in which a lot of American Catholics were more about becoming American, and increasingly over time, less about thinking about what it meant to be Catholic, what it might mean to be somewhat countercultural in the American context, because the need to succeed within the structures of the society as they existed seemed to trump everything else that might have come into conflict or change that narrative a bit. So we have a lot of books like how the Irish became white, how the Italians became white. So I mean, it seems the goal of assimilation was to become white. And as that happened, it seems to me that there was a loss in some instances of some of the other values that Catholicism would bring that might question some of the assumptions about how race has developed in the United States. Racism was pervasive, it was everywhere. It's not just a question of what was going on in the ethnic enclaves of the big cities. Of course, it was everywhere. But there were lots of things the church was trying to preach and the church was saying, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, that was inconsistent with what a lot of Catholics wanted to hear and what they were living in their experiences of race in the United States. And in other words, I think what we saw in this country was actually an increasingly hostile engagement amongst ethnic Catholics toward Blacks in this country. I mean, Herschella's story, I think, is a part of that, and mine as well. And a real question that I think arises about why it was so important for the church in this country to sort of situate itself in kind of this European mainstream way. And I'm hearing that some people are having trouble hearing me, so maybe this is helping. If it's not, let me know and I will. It is helping, okay. So anyway, I do think there's some truth to what he says. I think it's something that we can explore a little bit more deeply, but I'll let Herschella add her thoughts as well.
Yeah, let me just say on a lighter note, I was 18 years old before I stopped saying that I was Irish Catholic. I was taught by Irish Catholic nuns and priests, and I don't know, I had literally started college, and I was like, you are lots of things, but Irish Catholic, you gotta let go. But that says to me how strong the identification is with European whites and Catholicism, that it did not seem incongruous to me. And certainly none of the nuns or priests ever corrected me about that. You know, so, and I fully understand that I was Roman Catholic. I get that. So, you know, but I think much of what Vincent said is right and real, and I feel what he is saying. But let's take it to another direction in that same piece. I think you're getting there about the liturgy. And I can start talking then about, you know, the criminal justice system in this country.
Yeah, why don't we go there? I mean, William Massengill talks about interactions he had where he felt that people questioned his legitimacy as a priest, right, because of his race. That there was a presumption that a real priest is a white priest, and that an African American priest is lesser, as a priest, less authentic as a Catholic. And so, Herschella, what does that say to you about the liturgy? And I mean, I'm curious whether you know, if either of you have you know, noticed a difference in terms of the normativity of whiteness within Black Catholic communities versus majority white Catholic communities. Does the sort of assumption about Catholicism extend beyond the white Catholic community, or is it more pervasively a Catholic phenomenon?
Yeah, I don't think it's more pervasively a Catholic phenomenon. I think this is what is at the core of racism in and of itself, is that the legitimacy of whiteness is presumed in all occupations and vocations. There is a presumption of legitimacy given to my white male counterparts every day that I walk into a criminal courts building. There is a presumption that they are lawyers, and I will share this story also. I have an experiment because I teach students how to try cases. And whenever I send a white male student and a Black female student to court together, and I let them go before I get there, because at this point in my career, I can provide them, for lack of a better word, some protection in the building, because I've just, you know, the janitors know me there. But it has never failed when they go without me, that when I walk in the courtroom, the African-American woman is sitting in the audience with the family members, with people who are observing court. She is never in the well of the courtroom where lawyers are permitted to sit. And my white male student is sitting at counsel table. It has never failed. And when I ask her why she is sitting back here, she says to me, because the judge or the sheriff told me to go have a seat. And when I ask my white male student, well, what the hell are you doing sitting at counsel table? He says, nobody stopped me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, I would jump into a little bit about the liturgy in that, just to give a little bit of time to that part of your question. You know, the idea, I think one of the great gifts of the Catholic Church is its mission, its message of universality, and it's the way it transcends cultures. And I'd have to say, in my own experience, some of the most powerful masses I've attended around the world have been masses that have, you know, incorporated aspects of local cultures, and where I've seen just extraordinary demonstrations of faith, you know, through, you know, African dance and, you know, Brazilian music and all these other things. But I do think a lot of American Catholics, you know, resist the notion that those things can be part of a quote unquote normal experience of church. And so again, this sort of, European ideal that, imbues our society in the way Herschella just described in the professional sense of being a lawyer, of course, also imbues our society in the way we understand how the Mass is supposed to be and how we're supposed to present in church, how we're supposed to, engage with one another in the context of our liturgies. So yes, I mean, I think that's something we really have to think carefully about if we want to break down some of the structural racism that exists in our society and has either, invaded the church or has already, been a part of it.
Herschella, I took from your comments, a sense that in some ways that what Father Massingale is describing is sort of American Catholicism reflecting back attitudes that are pervasive in America, and not necessarily changing those attitudes. And Vincent, it sort of connects up with your point about the desire of American Catholics, especially white American Catholics, to fit in, right, to be American, and for better or for worse in some ways. And that reminds me a little bit of some of the research that's been done on the attitudes that Catholics display across a range of questions. And his research on the racial attitudes of white Catholics, Notre Dame political scientist Darren Davis found, I think both reasons for optimism and maybe some self-reflection and criticism. But he finds, that white Catholics have racial attitudes that at a kind of broad level reflect those of white Americans more broadly. But then he also, when he looks across different measures of racial resentment, finds that white Catholics demonstrate less, pervasively resentful attitudes than either white Baptists or white Protestants more generally. I think he finds 40% of white Catholics show racial resentment across the 4 different measures that he's looking at versus 61% for white Baptists and 47% for Protestants generally. And there's a little something there for everybody in the sense that there's it's less pervasive than among white Baptists, but 40% still seems like a quite high number. So, what responsibility does the institutional church bear for the racism of white Catholics? Are there kind of features of American Catholic teaching or of the church itself that reinforce these kinds of attitudes, or that could more effectively be deployed to try to change them? What do you think of that, Vincent?
Well, I mean, frankly, I think the teaching is powerful as an antidote to those numbers, moving those numbers. I think we have so many resources within our faith tradition and within its intellectual tradition and within our theology that would, if carefully considered and well taught, should be powerful weapons against racism. I mean, Catholic social teaching being something I spend a lot of time thinking about, I think makes gives us a lot of information and a lot of intellectual heft to engage to be anti-racist. But on the other hand, I would think that in the development of this society, Catholics have often been on the front lines, ethnic Catholics in particular, of some of the most charged, racial events in our history, certainly in the 20th century. So if we think about things like school busing here in Boston, and neighborhood block busting in big cities like Chicago and Detroit, and just neighborhood change in general in a lot of the cities, and the strong identification with geography and parish that I think often made it very difficult for people to separate sort of their claim of neighborhood from sort of the reality that other people share the space. So how that sort of has played out, why the church was not more aggressive in pushing Catholics to be a little bit more faithful to lots of church teachings, I think is complicated. I mean, I think it's as a sociological matter, as a practical matter, as an economic matter, there were a lot of things going on. And Catholics were doing very good things in the cities for Blacks and other people of color through the schools, and doing bad things through block busting and housing policy. So, it's a complicated question.
when I think about Catholic social thought and it, you know, its engagement with some of these questions, I agree with you that there are a lot of conceptual tools there to support an anti-racist agenda or movement. One thing that strikes me about the sort of body of Catholic social teaching is, you know, the focus on economic justice for sure, but maybe the less frequent discussion of questions of race. You know, that it's just not as, although I think the teaching of the church on this kind of conceptual level is clear, it maybe doesn't get, you know, questions of race don't get discussed quite as much. And, you know, as some of these more economically focused justice questions within that body of teaching. And so it's sort of a matter of emphasis rather than actual teaching. But I mean, do you share that intuition, or am I wrong about that?
No, I would agree that the issue of race is not as explicitly treated in Catholic social teaching as, you know, might be useful for this purpose. Of course, Catholic social teaching is being written, you know, for a global audience and isn't necessarily going to pick up, I guess, on the sort of specifics of each nation's or each culture's, you know, issues in this regard. But I think where it's helpful, so I don't disagree with that, but I think where it's helpful is on those structural issues like economic justice, on its sort of strong emphasis as a sort of against the kind of individualism that is so pervasive in American thought and in the way we look at societal problems. So, you know, concepts like solidarity and a more complex understanding of justice that has a more, you know, communitarian focus, I think can be really helpful in the United States and in the American context in breaking down some of the myths we have about how our society works. And if we can break those myths down, we will start, I think, to do a lot of racial healing just by virtue of the fact that we're starting to look at one another as members of the same community, and we're starting to see the suffering that structures of our society are imposing in particularly bad ways on Black people, for instance, because of the racist history of the nation and the history of slavery.
Herschella, you know, we talked about the connections with the criminal justice system. Do you see explicit connections between the racial attitudes of white Catholics and some of the pathologies in the criminal justice system that you've experienced? I mean, apart from what you already described in terms of the sort of general overlap in racial attitudes, but are there specific connections between the failures of the church to combat racism within its ranks and our, you know, society's failures on the criminal justice front?
The short answer is yes. Let me just sort of get right into it and give you what I've seen, and also what Chicago has always felt to me like a very Catholic city. You know, the parishes, you can name the churches, you know where the churches are located, you know that they are segregated. You know, we have always had cardinals and bishops who were national figures, not just local parish or local bishops. And because we have in Chicago a high Catholic population, many of the folks who are police officers and firemen and working in county or government positions in the judiciary are Catholic. And they have come out of the Catholic tradition. They have come from Catholic high schools, Catholic universities, and they bring with them, I think, for lack of a better word, an ambivalence, or they don't see the contradiction in their conduct in their workspace because the language and the education, again, I learned a moral code from going to Catholic school. I learned most of my values from going to a Catholic school. The benefit I had was that I then went home to a Black family that discussed this and talked it out, and what that looks like being African American also. And so I think, yeah, the church is implicated. We all are. We all, you know, there's no, I don't think this is about pointing fingers, but this is about talking about the structures and the people who control other people and why they might do so. And part of the history of this is when you have an immigrant population coming in, the goal is, I think, I have thought, is I've got to be better than African Americans. I cannot be lumped with that group of the citizenry. And in order to do that, then I will try to express my own feelings that, yes, white people are better than minorities. And again, Chicago is, you know, King said it, Chicago was the most racist city he had ever been in. And this was a man, you know, that grew up and lived in the South in Georgia and Birmingham. So, and there is a pride in Chicago communities about living separate and apart. You know, 20 or 30 years ago, everybody knew when you had crossed the dividing line, and yet you have police officers, to get more to the point, taking young Black boys into white neighborhoods and dropping them off after dark, saying, get home the best way you can. So, you know, and as the immigrant population has melted more into the white American, they have adopted the white American psyche, and it is racist to its core. And so we have police departments that are just racist. And I said to you guys earlier, and I'll say this and I'll, you know, let somebody else speak. We get the police that we want. I have always believed that. These are not outliers. These men and women are our fathers, our mothers, our sisters, our brothers. My uncle was on the Chicago police force for over 30 years and then a sheriff. So they go home. They go home to people just like we do. So any of their racist beliefs, we are implicated in. We feed them, we iron their uniforms, you know. So it's not just that we have a police force that is racist, and a criminal justice system that is stunningly racist. Again, these people go home to the rest of us. So we are all in this together, and we pay them to enforce racist, abusive practices, to over-criminalize Black conduct, to over-punish Black conduct. You know, the war on drugs was, everybody said that sounds right. Yeah, everybody wants to have a war on drugs. Nobody talked about the soldiers and the casualties. And that's where the conversation needs to go to now. These slogans don't work. We must talk about who are we talking about and know their connection to the rest of us in community.
One of the things that struck me, I think you both have touched on this in different ways, but the way in which the parish structure sort of feeds on underlying pathologies. And so the segregation in Chicago, the geographic segregation of neighborhoods is reflected in the segregation of parishes, and then that you know, and there are, you know, really positive things that come out of the geographic organization of the church and the overlapping ties within the parish structure. And I'm thinking here of this great book by John McGreevy about how protective the parish structure was of immigrant communities when they arrived, and created a really rich social life for those communities. But at the same time, it does lead to a kind of insider-outsider mentality, right? And to the extent that the underlying community is extremely segregated, the parish structure becomes segregated, and then the attitudes of Catholics kind of reflect that sociological reality. And I, Vincent, having lived in a lot of different places, you know, can you talk about your experience of parish life in Louisiana versus the Northeast or the Midwest, and how the parish can kind of either counteract or reinforce the sort of racist ideas?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think at the base of this, we have to remember just how racist housing policy has been in this country, and you know, how hard this nation worked to make sure that Black people did not have real meaningful opportunities to acquire wealth through the purchase of property, or if they did purchase property, they were limited to, you know, very sharply segregated areas. So during the time when the government was handing out money, you know, through the VA and the FHA and all this thing that built the great middle class in this country for a while, you know, Black people were either excluded from that or were forced to buy in areas where those investments would not, you know, would not mature, or would actually, become devalued for all kinds of reasons. So, you know, when you layer onto that, you know, a highly geographic understanding of parish in big cities, that's going to really change the dynamic. So in the South, for instance, you know, you had social segregation that existed, and you had efforts to give Blacks a little bit more autonomy by creating African-American parishes in the 50s in particular, so that they wouldn't be forced to just be observers, but they were always allowed to go to churches wherever they wanted to. And people moved through the society as Catholics in ways that I don't think were necessarily the same in some of the big cities in the Midwest in particular. I found the Midwest to be probably the most segregated big city experience that I have ever experienced in general. I found the DC area to be probably the least when it came to the ability for people to kind of move freely through the residential areas of the city. I think there was enough of a large African-American population there and enough of an understanding that African-Americans made up a substantial portion of the Catholic community in Washington, D.C. and Maryland, that it was not a shock, you know, to see Black people in Catholic churches, even though, of course, there was residential discrimination there as there was in every other place. But I think there was a level of education and a level of wealth there that allowed for Black people to move a little bit more freely. New York was, you know, kind of in between, and, you know, Boston, not so great. Very small Black population here, highly segregated as well, very ethnic city. So I guess in a way, the more ethnic a lot of these cities were, the more they became attached to these geographic notions of neighborhood, and the harder it became in many instances for Black people to you know, move freely and get, you know, new housing opportunities. I think there was a piece in the New York Times just yesterday with films of Black children being accosted in the mid-1970s in Queens, in the neighborhood of Rosedale, you know, because there was such a fear that, you know, Black people would, you know, take over the neighborhood. So, you know, it's been a real issue in the development of our residential neighborhoods in this country.
So before we turn to some questions from the audience, I thought it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on what the institutional church could do to be a more meaningful participant in current conversations about racial justice and police violence. I mean, what are some concrete things you think that the Catholic community or the institutional church can do in that regard? Herschella?
Yeah, I think, and this goes for they can do what all the rest of us have got to do. And that is where we are in our churches, have these discussions. And the lack of, you know, these discussions make us uncomfortable is just, it's too late in the universe to say that. It's time to get over your discomfort and look at what in your parish, in your neighborhood can change. And we need to strategize in each community, because different communities have different issues, and identify the 3 primary structural changes that need to be made. This is not going to all unravel by the end of the summer. So making that commitment and then institutionalizing committees to look at social justice issues institutionalizing committees to go to 26 in California and watch their criminal justice process. I'm certain that 95% of the people would walk out of there appalled at what passes for justice. To go, you know, to see what it's like to be incarcerated, to have discussions about the mass incarceration of people of color, of men of color, and what the implications of that are. And then so to educate the community about these issues with a commitment to making an effort, a directed effort towards at least one change. We cannot do it all, you know. So my advice is, you know, I would like for everybody to stay hopeful, because I don't believe that pessimistic people have the energy to make a revolution. So you have to stay hopeful. And that's how you do your work. I also don't think you can work well if you do not believe that your efforts will pay off. I think we should stay mindful. Again, check ourselves before, you know, your finger goes out. Ask yourself what you did yesterday, you know, to try to make it better. And then I think, you know, you have to stay prayerful. And what I mean by that is that any religious text that you read, if you understand it fully, I think it is a call for equality, whatever religion you profess. So I think if you take seriously what the teachings are, and I'll say this, I think if you take, as I had taken as a child, the teachings of the Catholic Church, we'd be further along than we are. So not to have that schizophrenic disconnect from Sunday in the rest of the week.
Yeah, I guess I would point to three things: one on the parish level, one on sort of the Catholic institutional level, and then one on the personal level for Catholics. On the parish level, you know, I think we have to start, you know, integrating these conversations into our faith life, and to build on what Herschella just said about, you know, what our faith actually teaches. What do the Gospels say? What has our church you know, developed in terms of its responses to these problems, and are we actually taking those responses seriously? So, for instance, in our parish, which is not very diverse, we're doing the Just Faith program, and we're doing the program on, you know, just racial equity and justice, and you know, we're calling people together to talk about race and to talk about the issues, because it's something that needs to be discussed, and it's an uncomfortable conversation, but we're doing it in the context of our faith life. We are integrating, you know, gospel passages and other, you know, passages from the Hebrew scriptures, and, you know, Catholic social teaching. All of that is informing the conversation and making it a part of our lived faith experience. So that's one in the parish. In our institutions, I think we have to start looking at our Catholic schools, our Catholic universities, our Catholic hospitals, whatever. If we're a Catholic hospital, we have to understand and think about what is going on in terms of the disparities in healthcare. In Catholic universities, I've been in academia for 30 years. I've worked at 3 Catholic universities, and, you know, I'm launching an effort with the president at Boston College on a forum for racial justice. It's our way of trying to, like, dig more deeply into these issues and to live them out in the community that we have on the university campus, and use the resources we have as educators, as scholars, to attack this problem, to attack this cancer. And then individually, individual Catholics need to start educating themselves about the kinds of issues that Herschella was highlighting, the things I mentioned about, for instance, housing discrimination, criminal justice. There's a lot of information out there that you know, you can read. Maybe you can commit with a group of other friends or by yourself to, I'm going to learn a little bit about mass incarceration. I'm going to read The New Jim Crow. I'm going to read Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. And I'm going to dig into these topics to understand a perspective that perhaps I wouldn't have normally had or wouldn't have normally received. And ask yourself, I mean, are those compelling to you in any way? And if they are, what do you want to do as a citizen about them? How will you engage the body politic to start asking for change. So as a Catholic, what are your responsibilities as a citizen when you get this information and you hear these stories and you hear about these injustices? So those would be my ideas.
Thanks so much to both of you. Let's turn to some of these great questions from the audience. Danny asks, what principles from our faith and Catholic social teaching can we draw from to better understand the call to defund the police?
Well, I think it seems like a direct path to me, but I think first we got to get clear, because this defund the police is getting distorted into something that I don't believe that it's intended to be. People will, so the first thing you need to do is get a clear understanding of what it means to defund the police, and understand that what people are asking for is a reallocation of resources for social services, for community needs, for mental health services, for better housing, that we put our money where our mouth is. It's not, I don't think there's anyone that expects to be taken seriously moving toward, let's not have any police officers. That's not what it is. So people need to get clear that we are all talking about the same thing before we start yelling at each other. And then you need to look at, again, and hold the police accountable, because most police forces will tell you that they have done, I think it started out years ago, it was called sensitivity training. And now they have, training about race or whatever. And I've observed some of these. It's real hard, though, when they're taught by racists. So you've got to be careful, and you can, and this is public information, which is the good news, is you can go find it for yourself. You can look at what the trainings are for the police force. You can see what money is being spent. And I will just say this, you can start thinking differently about certain things. If the police are paying out, if your city is paying out millions of dollars for wrongful death actions, your own self-interest in non-corrupt policing should be behind this and always mindful. And Chicago has paid out and will continue to pay out millions and millions of dollars for police misconduct.
Vincent, anything to add to that, or?
No, I think Herschella put it beautifully. I mean, remember the kinds of things that Catholic social thought engages are things like, what do human beings need to live in a dignified existence? And supporting the kinds of social programs that Herschella discussed is a great way to create the conditions in society that will start to undermine these antisocial behaviors and other things that are driving a lot of the fear, and there's a lot of fear in this country of the other.
I mean, one of the beautiful things about the Catholic social tradition, or the Catholic moral tradition more broadly, as it comments on institutions, is it's great pragmatism and in thinking about policing strategies. There's just a richness to its willingness to experiment with different solutions, and but within the framework that really values human dignity and freedom. And so if there are ways to ways other than coercion and violence to achieve an orderly society, now that strikes me as very much harmonious with that tradition. Here's a more personal reflection. My grandfather, this is from Michael, who was an Irish and German Catholic in rural Minnesota, used to tell me stories about being chased home from school by the Klan as a child. Perhaps naively, I inferred from these stories that there was a kind of natural bond between African Americans and Catholics, including white Catholics, at least insofar as they shared a common experience of being marginalized by the dominant Protestant majority. Do you think that such an affinity has ever existed as a social dynamic in American society, or has the divisive power of racism been too strong to allow it at the higher level, the macrocosmic level? I'm not sure. I'll add to this. I was listening to this podcast, Slow Burn, which is focused on, this season is focused on David Duke and his rise in Louisiana and his history with the Klan, but also the way he very specifically kind of broadened the invitation of the Klan to include white Catholics. And so can you comment on that, the kind of the shared experience of marginalization and how that should pull us together, but then this feeling of that being overcome by racism in the broader society? Vincent, do you want to take that on?
Sure. I think this is a fascinating issue that, has woven itself throughout the history of the United States. Why is it that people who have been marginalized, who have suffered, who have been brutalized in so many different ways by an economic system or by people who have captured so much of the nation's wealth or so many resources for themselves, why have those people, the marginalized amongst us, not joined forces? Why have we not found a way to unify? There are signs that maybe that's happening now, which is very encouraging. But over the course of our history, it was remarkably easy for elements in our political life and in our economic life, individuals, to divide and conquer. And I mean, one of those forces of division, or one of those ways of dividing, I think, was what I mentioned at the beginning, this creation of the notion of whiteness, which allowed people to at least believe that they were escaping marginalization because at least they weren't Black. But I think it was more than that. I mean, there has to be some, understanding, and clearly there's a lot of history that shows a lot of these groups did work together early on. I mean, the Irish and Blacks were often the poor living in shared neighborhoods in the big cities. The Italians, but at some point, the Italians and the Irish leave, and the Blacks are left behind, and there's no affinity anymore, or there wasn't in these past situations. So something was done, or something was going on structurally in this society that would cleave these people from each other. And to me, that was a great way of preventing the kind of unification of marginalized individuals that might challenge some of the economic and other systems in this country that don't work for most of us. So it's a conundrum, but maybe now people are starting to see that, in a sense, we've been duped. We've been duped into hating each other, and we're paying the cost. And maybe now it's time to fight.
Herschella, do you have anything to add to that?
No, you can take another question.
Okay. So I'm going to combine two questions here. Someone asked, we can't, this is Joanna's question, we can't get all the changes done that we want. What is the change that American Catholics are best positioned to make? And I'll add this to a previous question that talked about the parish, and it kind of plays off some of our conversation about the interaction between the parish structure and geographic segregation in places like Chicago and Boston. Samuel says, many of us see efforts to reach out to sister parishes as a possible solution, but this is rarely a two-way exchange. How do we create a broader local experience that would have to cut against the grain of segregated neighborhoods in favor of the larger church experience? And he adds, I love being Catholic, and I'm sad that I have to go out of town or downtown to see Black, brown, and Asian faces at Mass. So how do, what are the, if we're thinking about the, our earlier discussion, the kind of three things, concrete things that you talked about, what are the top priorities there, and what can we do at the local parish level to overcome the segregation and difference?
Well, I think, this is a time of opportunity. What we have seen, what I've seen over the last weeks are a lot of white people in the streets with Black Lives Matter signs. Now, if they mean it and they are churchgoers, then there should be now an opportunity for reciprocity, for, the pancake breakfasts at our parish this week and at yours, 3 weeks from now. And let me say this, it's not just, Catholics, but it just popped into my head, Dr. King's statement that the most segregated hour in America was church, was Sunday morning. So if that remains true, then the goal has to be how to unsegregate Sunday morning, if nothing else. So past failed attempts can't really hold us back. Now we can talk about then how to to do those things and get into some details, but it's got to be a willingness to want to do that. And then I think you've got to have a longer discussion that this panel won't allow for concrete steps based in what your community is, who your community is, who you are going to be doing this with on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis that will make it change.
Yeah, I would just add to that, here's an opportunity for us to maybe ask for some leadership from the bishops and from the institutional church. I mean, can we rethink how the parish is supposed to work? I mean, we understand why geographic parishes were created, and they did a lot of good, but they also did some harm. And, the harm is being, kind of strengthened by the other issues in our society, like housing discrimination and economic inequality. And, if we kind of rest on the notion that, well, you just go to the closest church to your house or in the town where you live or whatever, we're just going to reinforce that. So what can we be doing, in our parishes, in our conversations with the bishops, to rethink how the parish is supposed to work? And maybe the pandemic is giving us an opportunity. A lot of people aren't going to church in person right now. We're doing a lot of things online and virtually. That might be a great opportunity to build relationships, with other communities that we wouldn't normally be present with or to, and to start thinking about, well, how can we rethink how we worship? How can we share, different styles of liturgy together and learn from one another and sort of pray in ways that bring us together as Catholics within our tradition, but not recognizing the diversity that tradition embraces. So I guess we need to be a little creative, and we need to take some risks and to do some things differently. We don't have to do this the way we've always done it. There's nothing, I think, in the Gospels or in the magisterium of the church that says the parish has to look a certain way. It has to be a geographic neighborhood. I mean, I don't think so, but if it does, I'm sure there's some give to that too.
You mentioned the leadership of the church. I mean, do you sense a reluctance to kind of make this a top priority, to make the question of racial justice, to put it on par with some of the other things that the bishops talk about quite a bit? And should they make this a higher priority in their public pronouncements, in their kind of prophetic statements about American society?
Well, I would say yes. I mean, look, nothing has nothing has been more distorting in this culture than race and the history that has come to us from slavery. I mean, and the fact that we don't hear about it as more from our church leaders, I think, is very disturbing. I mean, so yes, but I'll let Herschella jump in. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Sorry, Herschella.
No, you are know more about this than me, and you said exactly what I was going to say. They got to up their game. It's got to be reprioritized.
So building on this, how well do you think that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops letter on racism, the Open Wide Our Hearts letter, grapples with racism in the church? Do you think it was an effective statement? Or?
I mean, it was a start, and I was happy to see it. I think these statements tend to be cautious. They aren't prophetic. They aren't, they don't push as hard as they need to push. They say things that need to be said. 'Tis true, but I think we need some real kind of powerful moral leadership at this time. I just think this country is hungry right now for, a kind of moral engagement around issues that matter. And I think, the Catholic Church is in a great position, given its pervasiveness around the country, to really be transformative in this regard. And I just don't know if all these statements really do that. They certainly, keep the issue warm and put it out there, but I think we may need more.
I mean, do you have any theories about the reluctance of the bishops to speak more forcefully on this issue,
I'm not sure that they know, and this goes to leadership, because to me, a lot of it was, but on the other hand, which says that there was a striving to balance. And I think you can't balance racism and anti-racism. They're not the same moral equivalent. And it felt like they weren't sure who was going to be reading this. And so it felt like not a firm statement about leadership, but a statement about, we're still thinking about this. And it was a good effort. I'm not saying, I read it, they acknowledged certain things, but it didn't feel like as a moral leader, the sort of command to do God's work.
Yeah, I just want to jump in real quick to add, they have done it. You know, during segregation, some of the bishops were extraordinary in their moral leadership. You know, the Archbishop of New Orleans, the Archbishop of Washington. The Archbishop of Washington desegregated the schools and the Catholic schools in the 1940s. And, you know, he made it clear that racism was a sin. The Archbishop of New Orleans did it later, but he made it clear racism is a sin and it is wrong. And he excommunicated people who fought him. Now, you know, the times have changed and there may be different ways of going about this, but I guess what I'm saying is it's not that they don't know how to do it, and it's not that they haven't done it. They have done it. So maybe, you know, they could think a little bit of, well, what drove those bishops and archbishops to do what they did at that time, and are we in a similar time now?
Just since I'm talking to two law professors, this question seems particularly appropriate. Is there anything you'd like to see Catholic law students, Catholic lawyers in particular doing? And is there something Catholic law students could do to build a community that supports people of all backgrounds and educates ourselves to build a more just future? And I would think this would include Catholic law students, not just at Catholic law schools, but in both Catholic and secular institutions. What do you think, Herschella?
Yeah, I would like to see them step up and take the lead in what, again, their faith has taught them. I think that they should both take opportunities there are lots of volunteer opportunities for law students to get in community in a real way, and not as you can't go sightseeing through Black communities and think you're being helpful. You know, the Black community adjacent to your law school this shouldn't be a bus tour. This should be about community engagement. I also think that they should do, this is a shameless plug, I also think that they should do clinical work. It doesn't have to be criminal work, but it should be clinical work where they work with people who cannot afford attorneys on housing issues. We have an entrepreneurship clinic at Chicago that helps people start up businesses. These things make a change, and a real change in people's lives. So I'm not just saying, you know, you need to do a criminal clinic. There are lots of civil clinics that impact, there's healthcare issues, there's healthcare law, there's benefits law. There are all types of things that students can get involved in and donate their time and talent as a way of giving to other people.
So to Catholic law students, wherever you are, I would say, I would want to speak to you in, you know, sort of these very kind of spiritual and religious terms, right? You're now you've been given these extraordinary tools. And I hope you view becoming a lawyer not simply as a way to get a good job, but as a vocation, as something that can be just not only transformative to the people that you can assist and help, but also transformative to you personally, but also transformative of the entire society. I mean, again, engage the law, engage the legal system, engage issues from the perspective of someone who is conscious of the structures of society and how they can harm individuals, and how people are completely sometimes incapable of protecting themselves. And you now are a person who's in the position to actually make change, to press justice forward, and think of justice in the most complex way possible, all the different ways that it can be, that it can matter and it can happen. And just imbue yourself with the fire about justice, and remember that being a lawyer is a privilege, and you have an opportunity to do great good. So that would be my hope.
So we're over time. I'm gonna ask one last question and then give you a final after this question. So this isn't the last question. This is the next to the last question. And then you'll have a chance to give your final words. But I just thought this was an interesting question. Julia asks, whether we have any recommendations for historical resources geared towards high school or college age classes about some of the history we've been discussing. And it's not more specific than that. So I guess I'd just ask you if you have a particular book that you would recommend to people interested in learning more about questions of racial justice. And since we talked a little bit about geographic segregation, I'll start, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts. But one of my favorite books, not a perfect book, but it's a really interesting book about the history of the sort of legal contributors to residential segregation. The pervasiveness of residential segregation is a book by a guy named Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law, which talks about the history of zoning, of racially restrictive covenants, the Federal Housing Authority, Federal Housing Administration's selective guarantee of mortgages in racially homogeneous neighborhoods, and the way that all of that kind of combined to contribute to really pervasive residential segregation in the United States. Herschella, any reading recommendations?
Yes, I have a reading recommendation. It's 500 pages. Okay, so don't just think you'll read it over the weekend. But it's called Stamped from the Beginning. It's a young scholar out of Florida. I can't think of his name, but if you want to email me, I will send you his name. But it's called Stamped from the Beginning, and it is a history of racist thought, starting from when the Mayflower landed to the present day, and it's an extraordinary book.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned too, Us Mercy by Brian Stevenson, and The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I think those are two well worth reading. I'll leave it there because there's so many.
Yeah, of course. No, those are all excellent recommendations. So now the last question, which is just to give you an opportunity to get the last word. Say any wrap up that you'd like to offer here before we close things up. Herschella?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, thanks for making me a part of this, and that again, in the 40 years that I have been practicing criminal law, if we must get to some point of compassion, to understanding that no one is as bad as their worst act. And that when we talk about, well, people should get what they deserve. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry I put this up. When people get what they deserve, be very careful, again, about how you pray, because I don't want to get what I might deserve for my worst actions. I'm with Brian Stevenson on this. I want a little mercy tempered with it. So when you think about what you have coming, don't always think about, I deserve to make X amount of dollars. I deserve to live here. I deserve to, be able to go on vacations or all of that. Think about how maybe you have to give something up so that everybody can get more of what they deserve. And that if you don't get all the good you deserve, it might balance out. You might not have to pay for all the bad that you deserve. So I think people need to find their spot. There's plenty of work to be done. You don't have to go looking for work. Whatever interests you in America, in any sort of social context, I would dare to say, has a racial component to it and a racist component to it that should be addressed. That's it for me.
Vincent, final thoughts.
Well, I will end on a hopeful note and a happy note. I think, I am very, very blessed to have inherited from my grandparents in South Louisiana this extraordinary Catholic faith tradition. And despite all of the barriers they faced and all of the issues they had to deal with around race, they never flagged in their view that this faith was their rock, and this church was their home. I'm very proud of what they built for me. And so I'm going to fight for it. And I want us to understand how many people in this church, despite all of these issues, not just from the church, but, from the society, love it and want it to be a home for all of us. And so I just ask you all to join with us, join with the people in your communities that you might not normally see, who are part of this great, Catholic tradition, and help us to, really make it the best it can be, and also help us to make it a real agent and force for change in a society that really needs healing and a society that really needs hope.
Well, I want to thank you both for a really rich and inspiring conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here and allowing me to be a little bit of an interloper and share the stage with you. It's really been a wonderful conversation. I've learned a lot. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eduardo. Thanks for
Great.
sharing.
Thank you. Thank all of you again on behalf of the Lumen Christi Institute. My name is Michael Le Chevalier. I'm Associate Director here for those of you who are joining us for the first time. And this is part of a broader commitment that the Lumen Christi Institute has to support the depth and breadth of the Catholic intellectual tradition. You can see some of our past programs with Darren Davis or Andrew Prévost on our website. We are also launching a summer seminar that was postponed from this year to next year for Thea Bowman Scholarship students. And any donation that you make during this time mentioning Thea Bowman in the comment will go to support this seminar that helps bring Black students who are going to Catholic schools together to interface the Catholic intellectual tradition and the broader African-American theological and cultural tradition in conversation. You can find out more on our website for any of our upcoming events. And otherwise, I want to thank our co-sponsors who have helped make this a successful event today. The Catholic Lawyers Guild of Chicago, the Hank Center at Loyola University, the Boston College Law School program, and America Media. Otherwise, please join me one more time in thanking our panelists for helping us engage in a difficult but a pressing topic in this time. And thank you especially, Eduardo and Dean Peñalver, for helping moderate this conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you.